The Eurorack format Klee is a frankly archaic 16-step analog sequencer designed around a bit shift register. If you're familiar with Tom Whitwell's Turing machine module, the Klee is easily described as a manually programmable Turing machine. Where the Turing machine gets all its output voltages and its bits from a random voltage source, the Klee gets all its voltages from the slider positions, and it gets all its bits from either the bit switches along the top or from input voltages. More on that later. The Eurorack format Klee panel is organized in what I think of as 4 areas, which I'll discuss in order. The 16 steps, which are the meat of the sequencer, the global controls and CV inputs in the center, the CV outputs, which output your slider voltages, and the bus outputs, which output gates and triggers based on the bus switch positions. Each step has a switch at the top, which sets the initial bit value when a load occurs. Above each switch is an indicator LED which shows whether that step is active. Notice that the switches don't take effect right away. The switches set the initial active bits when the sequence is loaded. So here I hit the load button, and I'll hit load again and they turn off. Every run step rotates the bit values to the right. The 16th bit wraps around and becomes the first bit. Also note that taking a step doesn't read the bit switches. Only a load will update the bits, and that does reset the step position. Finally, note that the load doesn't output a pulse. It's not triggering my envelope. The step slider sets the step's output CV, so let's open up our VCA. And that's instantaneous. So if you modify the step voltages while the sequencer is running, you'll hear swoops in real time. The step gate bus, which we'll describe in more detail at the end of the video, selects what gate bus should output a gate when the step becomes active. Let's sidebar for a moment to talk about step addition. If you have 2 or more voltages that are all active, so let's activate 3 and open up the envelope, their voltages add together. So any group of active steps contribute to summing a single voltage output. This tends to be, in a running sequence, unpredictable, weird, and if you have a lot of steps active, it tends to add up to high voltages. Here's our sequence with a single step active. This works like a basic CV sequencer. It simply outputs each step's voltage in order. Let's make a few more steps active in the pattern. Now for each step, all the voltage sliders for every active bit on each step are added together. The oscillator is producing higher pitches because the overall voltage level is higher now that we're adding the same voltages together in groups. This is the most confusing and unique feature of the Klee. If you want to quickly generate some unpredictable but repeatable and controllable CV steps, this is a great way to do it. Once you understand how step addition works, the rest of the Klee is pretty simple. Let's go over the main controls and CV inputs. There are 2 big buttons that you've already seen me using: load and step. Load instantly resets the bit switches and outputs whatever voltages have on bits. This is what a lot of sequencers would call reset, but on Klee it does that specific action. It loads the bits. Now step instantly advances one step, rotating the bits to the right. Note that there's no way to rotate to the left, and as I mentioned before, step outputs bus pulses. Load does not. A couple of the sequencer features treat the 16 steps as groups of 8 A steps on the left and 8 B steps on the right. So for example, if we flip 16 by 1 to 8 by 2, then the bits are rotated as two sets of 8 instead of one set of 16. Note that there's no way to clock these separately. The only change is how each step increments the bit rotation. 8 by 2 adds a wrap point in the middle. The other A-B control is invert B. If we flip normal to invert B, any bit that would wrap around from the B set of bits gets inverted when it wraps. On bits become off and vice versa. Let's turn on a few more bits and demonstrate. Since this only affects the B bits, if we're in 8 by 2 mode, you can see that the A pattern repeats normally while the B pattern inverts. The couple of bits that I set manually in the A group are repeating normally. The B group is inverting when it rotates. There's an article called Know the Klee, which has several pages with state diagrams illustrating the exact details of these A-B logic features. I'll link that in the video description. The big rotary switch here selects various ranges for the step CV. So let's go back to a single step, open up the VCA again, so you probably can't read on the video, but there's a minor, no, that's a major third, a perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, octave, 2 octaves, 4 octaves. If you build a Klee yourself, you'll spend a lot of time calibrating those. Let's see. The last value, range, activates this variable range knob. It lets you set an uncalibrated range from 0 to a lot. And again, notice, like the sliders, all of the range controls take instantaneous effect. There are some assorted switches around the range knobs that turn various things on and off. If the load switch here is on, a gate in the load jack will load the bits. Again, that's what most sequencers would call a reset. If the range switch is on, CV into the range jack will set the step range, and again this is instantaneous. Patching an external sequencer, an LFO, etc. into range can do some really wild stuff. As you've seen me use the clock switch, simply activates the clock jack. If it's off, no incoming clocks will be used. If it's on, they will. And since we're discussing the clock, this is as good a point as any to mention that since Klee is fully analog, it is perfectly happy being clocked at audio rate. This means you can use Klee as a very complex wave shaper as well as a sequencer. To wrap our discussion of the controls, we'll talk about the most interesting control, the random mode. Klee's random feature is confusing because it isn't random at all. It's just often used with random voltage inputs. Here, I have a low-frequency noise source patched into the random input jack. Let's activate random mode and then I'll go over the features. There are two pots affecting random mode. Random level is an input attenuator. Random reference sets a fixed reference voltage or threshold voltage. If the random level input is greater than the random reference when a step occurs, then the first bit in the pattern will be set to on. If not, it will be set to off. This is easier to show if I speed up the clock. If I turn the reference down, imagine lowering a sluice gate. It's easier for incoming voltage to spill over and fill a bit. If I turn it all the way down, it's like the sluice is fully open. All the bits are set. And if I turn it all the way up, the sluice is fully closed and no bits are set. So I said this wasn't random, so let me demonstrate. If I patch an LFO instead of a noise source into the random CV input, you can see now that whenever the LFO voltage crosses the random reference voltage, it turns on some bits. Let's go back to our noise source. Also, notice that when we're in random mode, the bits do not rotate. They just fall off the end of the pattern as new bits are generated, though a load does still have an effect. If we switch back to pattern mode, notice that whatever bits were set from the random mode are now wrapping around in a normal pattern. That's easier to see in 8x2 mode. So now I've switched it from random back to pattern mode, and we've captured 8 random bits that are now looping. Let's go back and forth again. So once again, we've switched from random to pattern, and we've captured and looped a segment of random bits. Finally, let's look at the output features of the module. So let's get back to our original pattern. The 3 pairs of jacks on the far left are for CV output. One jack is instantaneous, which is the left-hand one of each pair, and one has a glide pot for slewing the output. The slew can go quite slow if you want it to. This means with the slew that slow, you can use Klee as a fun, complex LFO, especially in random mode. Also note that, while we've been listening to a gated sequence this whole time, Klee is always outputting voltage. The other two pairs of jacks on the far left are separate A group and B group outputs. I am right now jacked into a combined CV A and B, which uses CV output across the whole sequencer. If I jack into CVB, we only get CV output from the B side. Same thing with CVA. Now this is obviously more useful in 8x2 mode. So now I'm in 8x2 mode, we're repeating 8 steps and I'm getting the output voltages from CVA. I could jack something else into CVB and get a separate set of voltages from CVB. Last of all, we have the bus output section. Each of the sequencer steps has a 3-position bus switch. Up is 1, middle is 2, and down is 3. We've been listening to bus 3 this entire time. I have this patch cable in bus 3 going to an envelope on our oscillator that we're hearing. Let's add an envelope on bus 2. That means now the switches in the middle position, those steps go to bus 2 and produce a separate bus output, which we're hearing as 2 different envelopes on the same voice. Now, I could use that second envelope for anything, for a sample trigger, a drum voice, advancing another sequencer, etc. So this is an opportunity for us to do some pretty complex stuff with what's effectively a single sequence. Let's go back to our bus 3 pulse. Each bus has 2 jacks in its group. It has a gate jack, which we're in now, and a trigger jack. Let's listen to that one. You can hear via the clicks, it's a very short trigger. Let's add a little decay. So if all you want to do is trigger a decay envelope or advance some other device in your system, the trigger outputs are great. Let's go back to the pulse output. So what's the length of that gate output? Well, in fact, it's exactly the length of your input clock pulse. If you want longer gates, just input longer clocks. I have this knob set up to control the pulse width of my clock, so let's listen to what happens when I change the pulse width. Driving the sequencer with an analog clock makes that a very powerful feature. Finally, each group of bus outputs has a merge switch associated with it, and that will merge back-to-back gates into a single longer gate. So if you're going into a complex envelope generator, you can get some really nice sustain out of that merge feature. Finally, I saved an interesting feature for the very end, the load bus 1 switch. Bus 1 is special. If you activate load bus 1, then any send on bus 1 will trigger a load, resetting the sequence and loading all of your bits. So let's turn on some bits over here. Every time we hit that 5th step, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th step, excuse me, we load all of the bits. This is a great way not only to create smaller looping sequences, but also to make sure that your loads happen exactly at a loop point. And remember, since Klee is analog, at fast clock rates, you can get some very interesting stutter effects. That's everything I have to show. I hope this was a useful overview of the Klee. If you have any questions, just let me know. Cheers and thanks for watching.